The medieval Queen Margaret of Anjou once let her young son choose how to execute his father's captors. What the boy chose was absolutely ruthless. Married to the mad King Henry VI, Margaret had to take control of her destiny for herself. The Wars of the Roses were not for the faint-hearted, yet Margaret schemed and warred with the best of them, right up until her own sad demise. Though she eventually became one of the most powerful women on earth, Margaret started as the second daughter of René, the disgraced King of Naples, and Isabella, the Duchess of Lorraine. People called King René a man of many crowns but no kingdoms, because he lucked into not one, not two, but 3 separate crowns. He was the King of Naples, the King of Sicily, and the King of Jerusalem. The only problem was he couldn't manage to rule any of them. Margaret was a ravenous learner and an obsessive with hobbies that ranged from romantic literature to more manly pursuits like hunting. Even as a girl, she clearly had the makings of greatness, but she sure didn't learn it from her hapless father. Her grandmother Yolande of Aragon single-handedly ruled the Duchy of Anjou and fought off English invasions. Then there was her mother Isabella, who personally fought wars on her husband's behalf and ruled the Duchy of Lorraine through sheer force of will. One day, Margaret of Anjou was a minor princess in a backwater duchy. The next, she was the Queen of England. Her uncle, King Charles V of France, arranged for her to marry King Henry VI of England when she was 14. On the surface, it seemed like a simple match. French princess marries English king, and the two countries bury the hatchet after fighting for quite literally 100 years. But in the cutthroat world of medieval Europe, nothing was ever so simple. Margaret couldn't have known it at the time, but she'd made an enemy for life when she married Henry VI. There were 2 major factions vying for power in England at the time, the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York. The Lancasters planned Margaret's match, and in doing so completely blocked the Yorks' plans to find their own bride for Henry. That means Richard, the Duke of York, was Margaret's sworn enemy the second she stepped foot in England. Henry VI became king when he was a baby. By the time he married Margaret, he was 23 and old enough to take the reins for himself. Problem was, he had absolutely no interest in being king. He'd much rather spend his time in church, or reading, or basically anything that wasn't ruling England. But unfortunately for Margaret, being king wasn't the only thing Henry wasn't interested in. Pretty much every king of England was an incorrigible womanizer, except for Henry VI. Henry wasn't interested in any woman, not even his wife, but at least there was one bright spot. Her marriage to Henry was surprisingly tender. The physical side was lacking, but by all accounts they actually seemed to care deeply about each other. Henry VI hit the jackpot when he married Margaret of Anjou. Not only did she love him, but she was the only person in the world who could protect the feeble Henry from the storm that was coming. Under his reign, Henry's kingdom started crumbling. His passiveness led to the gradual loss of much of the French territory gained by his father. As Henry lost more and more territory in France, disgruntled troops returned to England, out of a job and demanding pay. Since Henry couldn't find the money, they took to pillaging the countryside to take what they believed they were owed. Eventually, lawlessness and chaos ruled the land. Margaret and Henry were living a fantasy behind the walls of their palace, but it was only a matter of time before they had to face the consequences of Henry's mistakes. England may not have accepted women in roles of power in the era, but Margaret had one key advantage. Her husband adored her and would do pretty much anything she said. With Henry like putty in her hands, Margaret started whispering in his ear with one goal in mind. It was time to get rid of Richard of York. At the time, Richard of York was busy trying to clean up Henry's mess in France, but Margaret got Henry to essentially exile York to Ireland. By hiding him away on the Emerald Isle, Margaret had effectively cut her enemy off from all power. And as if that wasn't cold enough, she tried to have him assassinated twice. Richard of York managed to dodge Margaret's attempts on his life and make it back to London, where he took matters into his own hands. He confronted the king, and the spineless Henry VI didn't stand a chance. After a single talking to, Henry brought York back into his inner circle. But then York crossed a line. He had an MP suggest that he become heir to the throne. Margaret was having none of it. She dissolved Parliament and had the MP thrown in prison. York knew she'd beaten him. He fled London for Wales to bide his time and wait for his next chance to make a power grab. And as luck would have it, he wouldn't have to wait for long. In 1452, after 7 years of marriage, Margaret finally became pregnant. The birth of a son would put the nation at ease, not to mention quiet the disturbing rumors that had been floating around about the couple. The Duchy of Aquitaine was one of the richest territories in all of France, and the English had held it for centuries. In 1451, Henry VI managed to lose it to the French. This was the last straw. Henry and all of England were a disgrace. Women like Richard of York weren't going to put up with it any longer. When Henry VI heard that he'd lost Aquitaine for good, his mind simply broke. He couldn't speak. He could barely even get out of bed for an entire year. Margaret of Anjou had to watch her husband waste away, and it couldn't have come at a worse time. Henry was resting on a knife's edge, and Henry was in no state to rule. But for Margaret, that was the least of her worries. Henry's mental breakdown meant he completely missed the birth of his long-awaited son. Thanks to a bizarre custom, the King of England had to acknowledge his child in order for them to become heir to the throne. That meant that if Henry never recovered, Margaret's child would never become king. Even care of the catatonic Henry was no simple task. He had to be fed, washed, and clothed, and someone had to watch him at all hours of the day. England needed leadership, and whether they liked it or not, Margaret of Anjou was about to take charge. To help her fend off the likes of Richard of York and other enemies to the throne, Margaret sought out powerful allies wherever she could find them. She rallied around the Duke of Somerset and the Duke of Suffolk, mostly because they hated Richard of York as much as she did. But as her husband was nowhere to be found, and Margaret was spending more and more time around these strapping dukes, people started to talk. Rumors of infidelity would dog Margaret for the rest of her life, and her enemies would try to use them to take her down. Not too long after the birth of her son, the hated Richard of York managed to get himself named Lord Protector of England, while Henry remained unresponsive. Alongside his crony, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, who just so happened to be the richest man in England, York set about tightening their grip on the country. To plant the seeds of doubt in the English people, York and Warwick worked hard to spread the rumors that Margaret's son Edward wasn't actually Henry's. Not only did this make people distrust their French queen even more, but it also opened the door for someone else to become Henry's heir, namely York himself. Margaret of Anjou had good reason to be so wary of Richard of York this whole time. By some interpretations, the Duke actually had a better claim to the throne than Henry himself. Around Christmas 1454, Henry VI finally regained his senses. With him back in the picture, Margaret made her boldest move yet. She called for a great council and didn't invite anyone who supported the House of York. She called for everyone loyal to the king to join together, to protect him from his enemies. Margaret was done with subtle schemes and plots. She was taking Richard of York on once and for all. However, there's one thing she didn't account for. While Margaret tried to have York eliminated through political means, York himself took a decidedly more direct approach. He gathered his forces and marched straight for London. Margaret gathered a Lancastrian army to meet him head-on. The two sides met in battle for the first time at the First Battle of St. Albans. It did not go well for Margaret. Not only were several of her most important allies slain in the fighting, but Richard of York actually managed to take King Henry captive. York was willing to do a lot for power, but apparently regicide was too far. He dragged the captive king back to London and forced Henry to recognize him once more as Lord Protector of England. Thus far, Margaret had done a pretty good job of amassing power, but she was always fighting against one major issue. The people of England hated her. What she did in 1457 didn't help matters either. One of her cronies, a French general named Pierre de Brie, attacked the English coast and set the town of Sandwich aflame. Margaret hoped to sow chaos in England as a way to strengthen her position against Richard of York, but her plan backfired. Not only did the English repel de Bries, but everyone knew Margaret was behind it. If people hated her before, they despised her now. Margaret was starting to make a name for herself across Europe for all the wrong reasons. And this is the point when poor King Henry VI finally tried to take matters into his own hands. Cue the weirdest moment in English history. In 1458, he figured he'd come up with the perfect solution to the conflict in England, and he called it Love Day. Henry's big plan to end the Wars of the Roses was literally to make everyone hold hands and say they love each other. The fighting started up again almost immediately. In 1460, Margaret, King Henry, and their young son all showed up to personally lead their men at the Battle of Northampton. Unfortunately, the battle was a nutter disaster. Not only did the Lancastrians lose terribly, but the Yorkists captured King Henry yet again. Margaret of Anjou was nothing if not resourceful. If the English hated her, then she'd find support elsewhere. So that's what she did. She set sail for the greatest country in the world. She finally brought her northern army against York's at the Battle of Wakefield. The Lancastrians absolutely demolished the Yorkist forces, their first major victory of the conflict. For all of Richard's ambitions, he died like any other soldier at the Battle of Wakefield. The Lancastrian forces cut his head off and put it on a pike at the gates of the city of York. A reminder to all what happened to anyone who challenged Margaret of Anjou. Next up was the Second Battle of St. Albans, where Margaret personally led her armies against the remaining Yorkist forces, led this time by the Earl of Warwick, Richard Neville, also known as the Kingmaker. Margaret handily defeated her enemies once again and managed to rescue her husband after months in captivity. Richard of York was out of the picture. The Yorkists were on the run, and her husband was free. But there was one person Margaret didn't count on. Richard of York had a son, Edward. The House of York was far from down and out, and at the Battle of Towton, Edward did the unthinkable. In one fell swoop, Edward of York, with the Kingmaker at his side, defeated Margaret's armies, deposed Henry VI, and proclaimed himself Edward IV. Eventually, Margaret had to admit defeat and set sail back to France, bringing her son with her. She probably would have been finished if not for one important ally, her cousin, King Louis XV of France, who helped support her during her time there. She was going to do whatever it took to make sure young Edward of Westminster got to reclaim his birthright. For 7 long years, Margaret trained her boy and bided her time, until a surprise came knocking at her door. Out of nowhere, the last person she ever expected came offering his help. Richard Neville, the Kingmaker, the same man who helped Edward IV dethrone her husband. Edward had married Elizabeth Woodville, a woman from minor nobility, leading to a falling out between him and Neville. After making him kneel for 20 minutes, Margaret forgave Neville for his treachery, and the two set about planning how to reclaim the English throne. Margaret married her son to Neville's daughter. That way, when they reclaimed the throne, each of them would have a piece of the crown. Evidently, Margaret didn't trust Neville just yet. She made him take his men to England ahead of her to prove his worth. At first, it seemed like her plan went unbelievably well. Neville stormed London, freed Henry VI from the Tower, and made him king once more. Margaret set sail for England not long after Neville's victory, but she was too late. On the day that she landed on English soil, Edward IV's forces turned the tide. They fought Neville at the Battle of Barnet and defeated him. With Neville gone, there was only Margaret left to lead her forces, And that's exactly what she did at the Battle of Tewkesbury. When the instant her son was born, everything Margaret did was to ensure he got to take his rightful place as King of England. That all ended at Tewkesbury. Edward IV's forces annihilated her army, and her 17-year-old son Edward was killed. Margaret had spent nearly 20 years fighting tooth and nail for her son's birthright. With him gone, she was finally completely defeated. From that day on, Margaret of Anjou was a ghost of her former self. Edward IV's forces easily took her captive after the fighting stopped and dragged her back to the Tower of London, where her husband was also being held. Edward IV had kept Henry alive all these years because he was less of a threat than his son. However, with young Edward out of the picture, there was no reason to keep Henry around either. Historians agree that Edward had Henry executed shortly after Tewkesbury. Margaret spent 5 years as a prisoner in England until Louis IX of France ransomed her back in 1475. She ended up living in France for 7 more years until she died, impoverished and alone at the age of 52. With this story of a fierce, ruthless queen who will do anything to protect her children rings a bell, it might be because Margaret of Anjou was actually George R.R. Martin's main inspiration for the character of Cersei Lannister in his Song of Ice and Fire books. The most ruthless act of Margaret's entire life came shortly after the Second Battle of St. Albans, the battle where Margaret's forces rescued the captive Henry VI. During the fighting, 2 men, William Bonville and Sir Thomas Curiel, watched over the captive king. When the fighting stopped, Henry promised that he would show these 2 men mercy. Going against her husband's wishes, Margaret put the 2 men on trial for treason. According to several reports, she asked her 7-year-old son how the 2 men should die, and his response was absolutely ruthless. The Battle of Prince Edward demanded that the 2 men be beheaded. Now there is a mother-son duo you would not want to cross.